They thought he'd stay quiet. Small-town HOA, armed with paperwork and arrogance, sold off 1,500 acres of land that had been in his family for generations. Land his ancestors had worked, bled for, and protected. To them, it was just property. To him, legacy. But here's what they didn't expect. He found a way to fight back. And when the dust settled, the people who took from him lost the very homes they lived. This isn't just a story about land. It's about justice. And it's a kind of justice they'll never forget. For generations, the Walker family's land stretched as far as the eye could see. Rolling hills, thick woods, and open fields that carried the echoes of family reunions, hard work, and history. It wasn't just soil and trees. It was a living reminder of how far they'd come and how much they'd sacrificed. Samuel Walker, the latest in the long line of caretakers, never thought much about the land was as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He spent his mornings walking the property, checking fences, and greeting the same neighbors he'd known his entire life. In his mind, nothing could threaten what had been theirs, but small-town politics can move quietly, storm building on the horizon. The local HOA had been eyeing portions of his property for years, convinced that they could turn it into a high-end residential development. Meetings were held, papers were filed, and while Samuel went about his days certain that no one could touch his land, someone else was making decisions that would change everything. It started with whispers, a neighbor mentioning new property lines, a letter that seemed like a clerical mistake. But beneath the surface, something was already in motion, and Samuel was about to discover just how quickly a lifetime of history can be stolen. The first sign that something was wrong came in a plain white envelope. No seal, no warning, just an official-looking document stating that 300 acres of Samuel's land had been reclassified for development. He stared at the paper, convinced it had to be a mistake, but the more he read, the more his stomach twisted. The signatures at the bottom weren't his. A trip to the county records office confirmed his fear. Page after page showed transactions he'd never approved, parcels of his family's property legally sold to buyers connected to the HOA board. Their justification? An obscure clause in a decades-old zoning agreement that claimed the land was underutilized and subject to community reassignment. Samuel had never even heard of it. The more he dug, the more the truth came out. Meetings had been held without his knowledge, votes taken in rooms he was never invited into. The land had been appraised at a fraction of its real value, then sold to developers who had personal ties to HOA leadership. It was theft, wrapped in legal jargon.
Samuel hired an attorney, but the HOA came armed with deep pockets and political connections. Every motion to stop construction was delayed or denied. Bulldozers arrived before he could even file his second appeal. Within months, the first foundations were poured on what had once been his grandfather's pasture. Friends told him to walk away, to let it go before it drained him financially and emotionally, but Samuel couldn't. This wasn't just about land, it was about erasure. Every acre they took was a piece of his family's story ripped from the earth. Then came the breaking point, an article in the local paper celebrating the revitalization project. The headline boasted, "New luxury homes replace unused land." In the accompanying photo, HOA board members stood smiling in front of a sign that read, Walker Estates. They'd even stolen his name. That night, Samuel sat at his kitchen table surrounded by decades of family deeds and letters, and made a decision. If they could use the law to take from him, he would use the law to take something far more personal from them. The plan began quietly. Samuel's attorney discovered that many of the HOA board members had purchased their homes under a complex but flawed land trust arrangement, one that made their properties technically vulnerable to public auction if certain debts were called in. Samuel started buying those debts, one by one, quietly, patiently. He used every connection he had, every dollar he could gather, even selling off some unused equipment from the farm. Months passed, and the board remained smug, convinced he'd been defeated. They didn't know they were standing on a trapdoor. The day it snapped shut came on a crisp autumn morning. Certified letters went out to every board member's home, notifying them of impending foreclosure proceedings. At first, they assumed it was a clerical error, until the legal filings arrived, each bearing Samuel's name as the creditor. By noon, the phones were ringing off the hook. Board members begged for meetings, offered settlements, even tried to intimidate him. But Samuel had learned their game, and this time the law was on his side. 2 months later, the first auctions began. Crowds gathered, cameras rolled. The same people who had smiled in the newspaper posing in front of Walker Estates now stood pale and silent as strangers bid on their living rooms, their kitchens, their front yards. Samuel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. As the final gavel fell on the last property, he simply walked away, leaving them with the same emptiness they'd once left him. It wasn't about the money. It was about showing them, and everyone watching, that taking from a man who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous mistake you can make. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the county line. Local news stations ran segments calling it the ultimate legal revenge. Online forums buzzed with the details. Some praised Samuel as a hero. Others called him ruthless. He didn't care about either label. What mattered was the quiet that returned to his land. No more bulldozers. No more letters with hidden agendas. Just the wind in the trees, the same as it had been for generations. The luxury homes that had been built on stolen acres, many sat empty, caught up in legal disputes that Samuel's lawyer made sure would drag on for years. Developers backed out. The revitalization project crumbled. For Samuel, the victory was bittersweet. The land his family had lost could never truly be replaced. But he'd sent a message, not just to the HOA, but to anyone who thought generational history could be signed away like a casual transaction. He began speaking at community meetings, warning other landowners about the tactics HOAs and developers use.